Welcome to this episode of Great Cities and Institutions. Today, we are going to look at the Tower of London, a building that has been standing for nearly 1,000 years, that has been a palace, a treasury, a zoo, a mint, an observatory, a records office, an arsenal, and a fortress, and that most people believe was principally a prison. It was not. In 950 years, the number of people executed inside its walls is smaller than the number of ravens it currently keeps by a factor of about 2. Every week on this channel, we step inside the great cities, empires, and institutions that shaped the world we still live in today, tracing not just when they rose, but why and what it actually cost to build something meant to last forever. Some of these stories are about walls and monuments still standing. Others are about entire systems of government and belief that vanished centuries ago, yet somehow still shape how we live, how we're governed, and even the words we use, without most of us ever realizing it. Today's story is about a building that has done nearly every job a state requires, continuously since 1066, and which has never once been taken by an enemy force. By the end of this episode, you will know why William the Conqueror built it, where he built it, what the White Tower was actually for, how a fortress became the national bank and the National Zoo simultaneously, what really happened to 2 children in 1483, why the ravens are almost certainly a Victorian. Before crossing the Thames upstream and approaching from the northwest. London submitted, and he was crowned at Westminster on Christmas Day. And then he did what a conqueror with a hostile capital does. He built. Contemporary accounts describe fortifications thrown up within the city almost immediately, and the account of Ordericus Vitalis notes that certain strongholds were made in the city against the fickleness of the vast and fierce populace. Note that phrasing, against the populace, not against an invading army, which is the first thing to understand about the Tower of London. It was not built to defend London, it was built to control it. Around 1078, William began replacing the initial timber work with something permanent, and the man generally credited with directing it is Gundulf, later Bishop of Rochester, a Norman churchman with a reputation as a builder. The site was chosen with care. It sits at the southeastern corner of the old Roman city wall, which meant 2 of its sides were already defended by existing Roman fortification. It sits directly on the Thames, giving access by water, which matters enormously for supply and for escape. And it sits immediately downstream of the city, which means it commands the river approach to London. So it watches the city on one side and the river on the other. The building that went up is the White Tower, and it is worth being precise about what it is. It is a keep, roughly 36 by 32 meters at the base, around 27 meters high to the battlements, with walls up to 4.5 meters thick at the bottom. It was faced in Caen stone, imported from Normandy, which was expensive and was the point. Kentish ragstone was used for the bulk of the fabric. It was, when built, comfortably the tallest and largest building in London, and one of the largest keeps in Europe. For a city of timber and thatch, a stone tower of that size would have been simply unprecedented. And it was whitewashed. That is where the name comes from. Records from the 13th century record the exterior being limewashed under Henry III, and the effect would have been a vast white block, visible for a considerable distance in every direction. Consider the message: a conquered city, a foreign king, and a white stone tower, larger than anything the population had ever seen, built partly of stone, shipped from the conqueror's homeland, standing over them. The construction itself is worth a moment. Building in stone at that scale was, in 11th century England, an unusual undertaking. The Anglo-Saxons had built substantial churches, but secular stone building on this scale was essentially a Norman import, and it required skills that had to be brought in. The Caen stone came by sea from Normandy, across the Channel and up the Thames, which was cheaper than moving it overland, even from English quarries, because water transport was vastly more efficient than carting. That is a recurring feature of medieval building, and it explains why so many great structures sit on navigable water. The mortar was lime-based, and the walls are not solid dressed stone, but two faces of cut stone with a rubble and mortar core between them, which is standard practice and which is why the walls are so thick. Construction proceeded slowly, over roughly 2 decades, and it was labor that had to be found locally, which, in a recently conquered country, means labor that was compelled. The tower was built with 4 floors, including a basement, and originally the entrance was at first floor level rather than at ground level, reached by an external timber stair that could be removed. That is a standard defensive arrangement in Norman keeps, and it is why the present entrance is a later alteration. Inside, it contains something that is easy to walk past. The Chapel of St. John the Evangelist is a Norman chapel occupying 2 stories of the building, with massive round columns and plain cushioned capitals, essentially unaltered since it was built. It is one of the best preserved pieces of 11th century architecture in England, and it is inside a building most people visit for the executions. Now, the expansion, because the tower we see today is not one castle, but 3 centuries of building. Richard I's Chancellor, William Longchamp, extended the defences in the 1190s while Richard was on crusade, digging a ditch and adding to the enclosure. That work was tested almost immediately when Longchamp was besieged there by the king's brother John and forced to surrender, which is the only occasion the tower has fallen to a besieging force, and it fell because the garrison gave up rather than because the defences failed. The great expansion came under Henry III and his son Edward I in the 13th century. Henry built the inner curtain wall with its towers, constructed a substantial royal palace within the walls, and it was he who had the keep whitewashed. Edward, whom we have now met 3 times in this castle's sequence, did what Edward always did. He spent enormous sums, and he built concentrically. He added the outer curtain wall, creating a complete second ring around the first, which produces the concentric arrangement we described in the Welsh episode. An attacker who breaches the outer wall finds himself in a killing ground overlooked from a higher wall behind. He filled and refilled the moat, employing a Flemish engineer to make it work properly by connecting it to the Thames. He built the entrance complex, including a new water gate, and he moved the Royal Mint into the tower and the crown jewels with it. By around 1300, the tower had substantially the layout you can walk around today. 21 towers, 2 curtain walls, a moat, and a palace inside. Now the part that surprises people most, which is what the building actually did for most of its history. It was a palace. Successive monarchs lived there, held court there, and by tradition, spent the night before their coronation there, processing from the Tower to Westminster the following morning. That tradition continued until the 17th century. It was the Royal Mint. English coinage was struck inside the Tower for roughly 500 years, from the late 13th century until the Mint moved out in the early 19th. Isaac Newton served as warden and then master of the Mint, working from the Tower, and pursued counterfeiters with a diligence that surprises people who know him only as a physicist. He personally interrogated suspects and sent a number of coiners to the gallows. It was the Jewel House, and it still is. The crown jewels have been kept there since the 13th century, apart from an interruption we will come to. It was the National Arsenal. The Board of Ordnance was based there, storing and manufacturing weapons and armor on a large scale, and this was arguably the tower's most important function for several centuries. It was the public record office. State records were stored in the Wakefield Tower, and the accumulation eventually became so unmanageable that a dedicated building had to be constructed elsewhere in the 19th century. It was an observatory briefly before the Royal Observatory was established at Greenwich, and it was a zoo. The Royal Menagerie began in the 13th century and lasted more than 600 years. It started with gifts between monarchs, because exotic animals were diplomatic currency in the medieval world. Henry III received 3 big cats, generally described as leopards, from the Holy Roman Emperor. He received an elephant from the King of France, and the records include the construction of a house for it and the expense of its keep. And he received a polar bear from the King of Norway, which was kept on a long chain and, according to the records, permitted to swim and fish in the Thames. That is a real entry in the royal accounts. A polar bear, on a rope, fishing in the Thames in the 13th century. The menagerie expanded over the centuries and became a public attraction, at one point with an admission price of 3 halfpence, or, according to a widely repeated account, a cat or a dog to feed the lions. That second detail may be embellishment, but the menagerie was certainly open to the public and certainly popular. It closed in the 1830s, when the animals were transferred to the new Zoological Society collection in Regent's Park, which became London Zoo. So for most of its existence, the Tower of London was a combination of royal residence, National Bank, armory, archive, and zoo. The prison function was real, but it was secondary, and it was intermittent. Before the corrections, one more function, and it is the one that best explains the Tower's relationship with the city outside it. The Tower was where the Crown kept things it did not trust the City of London to hold. Medieval London was not simply part of the kingdom. It was a corporation with charters, privileges, its own courts, its own militia, and a jealous sense of its independence. And the relationship between the Crown and the city was a negotiation that went on for centuries. The Tower sat at the edge of that relationship, physically and politically. When the city was cooperative, it was a royal residence downstream. When it was not, it was a garrison with the guns pointing the right way. It also functioned as a refuge. During the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, the young Richard II sheltered in the Tower while the rebels entered London. The mob then got inside the fortress itself, apparently because the gates were opened or the garrison did not resist, and dragged out the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Treasurer, both of whom were beheaded on Tower Hill. That is a striking episode, because it is the only occasion on which the Tower was entered by a hostile crowd, and it happened without a siege. It suggests something the walls could not solve. A fortress in the middle of a city depends on the city's acquiescence. The Tower also held the Crown's financial machinery in a more literal sense than the mint alone. Medieval English kings borrowed extensively from the Jewish community in England, whose members were, in law, under direct royal protection and effectively the king's property. The Tower served at various points as a place of refuge and of confinement for them, and in the persecutions and mass imprisonments of the 13th century, very large numbers were held there. In 1278, hundreds were imprisoned in the Tower on accusations of coin-clipping, and many were executed. That is a part of the building's history, which is far less discussed than the Tudor executions, and the numbers involved are considerably larger. The Jewish community was expelled from England entirely in 1290 by Edward I, and the debts owed to them fell to the crown, which is a pattern we saw repeated in France in the episode on the Knights Templar. Which brings us to the correction that this episode exists to make. The Tower of London was never primarily a prison, and remarkably few people were executed in it. Let me give you the numbers, because they are startling. Executions within the Tower walls, on Tower Green, across the entire medieval and Tudor period, number 7. 7 people. They were, in order, William Hastings in 1483, executed summarily during the crisis we will come to. Anne Boleyn in 1536. Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, in 1541. Catherine Howard and Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, in 1542. Lady Jane Grey in 1554. And Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, in 1601. Note what they have in common. With one exception, they are women, or they are people of the highest rank, and in every case, privacy was the point. Execution inside the walls was a privilege, granted to spare the individual, or more accurately, to spare the crown, the spectacle of a public death. Public executions of Tower prisoners took place outside, on Tower Hill, and those were numerous, running to well over 100. But Tower Hill is not the Tower. It is the open ground beyond the walls, and the distinction matters because the popular image collapses the two. There were also executions in the 20th century. During the First World War, 11 men were shot at the Tower for espionage, and one during the Second World War, Joseph Jacobs, in 1941. He was shot by firing squad in the miniature rifle range while seated in a chair because he had broken his ankle parachuting into England and could not stand. He was the last person executed at the Tower. So the total across 950 years is around 22 people inside the walls. Meanwhile, the Tower currently keeps at least 6 ravens by tradition, with spares. The prisoners themselves are the more interesting story. And the point about them is that imprisonment in the Tower was generally a mark of status rather than a punishment for ordinary crime. Ordinary criminals went to Newgate, to the Fleet, to the Marshalsea, and to county jails. The Tower was for the politically significant, royalty, nobility, senior clergy, and people whose imprisonment was itself a political act. And conditions varied enormously with rank. A prisoner of standing might occupy comfortable rooms, receive visitors, be attended by their own servants, and even walk in the grounds, which produces one of the great pieces of graffiti in Europe. The walls of the Beauchamp Tower are covered with carvings made by prisoners, names, dates, heraldic devices, religious inscriptions, and elaborate emblematic designs. Some are crude, some are extraordinary works, cut over months by people with nothing else to do and, evidently, access to tools. Among them is the name Jane, carved into the wall, traditionally associated with Lady Jane Grey, though it was more likely cut by supporters of her husband. The list of prisoners is a survey of English political history. 2 future monarchs were held there: the young Princess Elizabeth, imprisoned by her half-sister Mary, and later Elizabeth I, and, much earlier, the deposed kings, whose deaths are murkier. Thomas More was held there before his execution on Tower Hill. Bishops Fisher, Cranmer, Ridley, and Latimer. Guy Fawkes and his fellow conspirators. Walter Raleigh, 3 separate times, including a stretch of 13 years, during which he lived with his wife and family, fathered a child, conducted chemical experiments, and wrote a history of the world. That last detail is worth sitting with. A man imprisoned in the Tower under sentence of death wrote a substantial work of scholarship there, and his son was born there. And Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy, was held there briefly in 1941 after flying to Scotland, making him one of the last prisoners of the Tower and placing a Nazi in a building begun by William the Conqueror. Now, the torture question, which requires precision. Torture in England was not lawful under common law. It could only be authorized by warrant of the monarch or the Privy Council, and such warrants were exceptional. Records of these warrants survive, and the number of people known to have been tortured at the Tower is in the region of 50 over about a century and a half, concentrated in the period of religious and political conflict from the mid-16th century to the mid-17th. The rack was used, and the Tower's rack acquired a nickname, the Duke of Exeter's Daughter, after the constable who was said to have introduced it. Guy Fawkes was tortured following a warrant from King James, and the change in his signature between his first and later confessions is frequently displayed as evidence of what was done to him. The Scavenger's Daughter, a compression device that did the opposite of the rack, was another instrument associated with the Tower. But 50 cases across 150 years is not an industrial operation, and torture was legally abolished in England in the 1640s. The image of the Tower as a permanent torture chamber is largely a later construction. Now, the two children, because it is the most famous mystery attached to the building, and it deserves careful handling. In April 1483, Edward IV died unexpectedly. His heir was his son, Edward V, aged 12, and the boy's uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was named Protector. The young king was brought to London and lodged in the Tower, which was entirely normal, since monarchs traditionally stayed there before coronation. His younger brother Richard, aged 9, joined him. Then a claim was advanced that Edward IV's marriage had been invalid, which would make both boys illegitimate. Parliament accepted it. The coronation was cancelled, and Richard was crowned King Richard III. The boys were seen in the Tower grounds during the summer, and then they were not seen again. What happened to them is not known, and I want to be honest about the state of the evidence rather than pick a side. The case against Richard is that he had motive, that he had the opportunity, that the boys disappeared while in his custody, that he never produced them alive to counter rumors that were already circulating within months, and that contemporary and near-contemporary sources record the suspicion. The case for doubt is that no bodies were identified at the time, no formal accusation was made during his reign, and the most detailed accounts, including Thomas More's and subsequently Shakespeare's, were written under the Tudor dynasty that had defeated and replaced him and had every reason to blacken him. Alternative suspects have been proposed, principally Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, and Henry Tudor himself, who also had a motive and who was in a position to act after 1485. In 1674, workmen demolishing a staircase in the White Tower found a wooden box containing the bones of two children. Charles II had them interred in Westminster Abbey as the presumed princes. They were examined in 1933 by methods that would not now be considered adequate, and the conclusion drawn at the time was that they were consistent with the ages of the boys. That examination could not determine sex, could not date the bones, and could not establish cause of death. Requests to re-examine them with modern techniques, including DNA analysis, have been made repeatedly and have not been granted. So the honest position is that two children disappeared in the custody of a man who benefited from their disappearance, that this is legitimately suspicious, that it is not proven, and that a test which could settle a substantial part of the question exists and has not been permitted. Now, the Ravens, and this is the correction that most surprises visitors. The legend states that if the ravens ever leave the tower, the kingdom will fall, and that Charles II, told of the prophecy, decreed that 6 ravens must always be kept. That story is repeated everywhere, including in a good deal of official material. The historical evidence for it is very thin. Researchers examining the record have found no reference to ravens at the tower before the 19th century. The Charles II story does not appear in 17th century sources, and the earliest references to the legend appear to date from the later Victorian period or even the early 20th century. What seems to have happened is that ravens, which are carrion birds and were common in London, were associated with the tower, that they were kept as pets or curiosities in the 19th century, and that a suitably ancient-sounding legend was attached to the practice afterwards. That does not make the ravens less real. There are ravens at the tower today. They are cared for by a raven master. They have names. They have their flight feathers partially trimmed to keep them in the vicinity, and they are a genuine institution of the place. It is simply an institution, roughly 150 years old rather than 350, which is a good moment for the other Victorian invention. The tower's entire modern character as a visitor attraction was substantially constructed in the 19th century. Access had been possible for a long time, but from the 1850s, the tower was deliberately restored, and the restoration was ideological. Anthony Salvin, and later John Taylor, removed post-medieval additions, including a good deal of genuine Tudor and Georgian fabric, in order to return the building to a medieval appearance it may never have had. Buildings were demolished. Windows were reshaped. Towers were given the profiles that Victorian architects believed a medieval castle ought to have. At the same time, the presentation shifted decisively toward the grisly. The armories had displayed weapons and armor. Increasingly, the emphasis moved to the block, the axe, the dungeons, and the executions, because that is what the growing number of visitors came to see. So a great deal of what feels most ancient about the tower is Victorian, and the reputation as a house of torment was consolidated in the same period, which is worth stating plainly, because it is the same pattern we found in Scotland with the baronial revival and at Carcassonne in France. The 19th century did not merely preserve the medieval past, it substantially designed the version of it we now recognize. Now 3 words and expressions, since this channel has a habit. The first is beefeater. The yeoman warders were established as a body under Henry VII or Henry VIII, and they remain the ceremonial guardians of the tower. Every one of them is a former senior, non-commissioned officer with a long record of military service and decorations, and they live within the tower walls with their families. The origin of beefeater is genuinely uncertain. The most commonly given explanation is that the warders were entitled to a substantial daily ration of beef from the king's table, which in an era when meat was a luxury was a notable privilege and would have marked them out. An alternative suggestion connects it to a French word for a servant, though that derivation is generally regarded as weaker. The warders are not the yeomen of the guard, who are a separate body attending the monarch, and confusing the two is a reliable way to irritate a warder. The second is the phrase to be sent to the tower, which entered English as a synonym for political disgrace precisely because imprisonment there was reserved for the significant. You could not be sent to the tower for theft. You had to matter. And the third is one of the strangest survivals in Britain. The ceremony of the keys is the nightly locking of the tower, and it has been performed every night, without interruption, for something in the region of 700 years. It has continued through plague, through civil war, through the Blitz. There is a documented occasion in the Second World War when the ceremony was delayed by a bomb blast, and the chief yeoman warder wrote to apologize for the lateness. He received a reply indicating that the delay was understood, given the circumstances. The ceremony still takes place at the same time every night, and the public can apply to attend. Now, some later chapters, briefly. During the English Civil War, the Tower was held by Parliament, and Cromwell had the medieval regalia broken up and melted down on the grounds that the monarchy had been abolished and the symbols with it. Only a very small number of items survive from before this, notably the anointing spoon and, it is believed, some of the ampulla. The crown jewels displayed today therefore largely date from the Restoration in 1660 and afterwards, which is worth knowing when you see a queue of people waiting to see medieval regalia. And in 1671, Colonel Thomas Blood attempted to steal them. He befriended the elderly jewel house keeper over some weeks, posing as a clergyman, arranged for his supposed nephew to marry the keeper's daughter, and returned with accomplices to view the jewels privately. They attacked the keeper, flattened the crown with a mallet to conceal it, sawed the scepter in two, and attempted to leave. They were caught inside the tower with the crown down a coat and part of the scepter in a bag. And then something extraordinary happened. Blood refused to speak to anyone but the king. Charles II granted him an audience, and instead of executing him, pardoned him and granted him lands in Ireland with an income. The reason has never been established. Suggestions range from Charles's amusement at the sheer audacity to a debt owed, to the possibility that Blood had been useful as an informer, to the theory that Charles, chronically short of money, had some involvement himself. It remains one of the strangest unresolved episodes in the building's history. In the 1840s, the tower was garrisoned against Chartist demonstrations, and the Waterloo Block was built as barracks, which is where the crown jewels are now displayed. In 1841, a great fire destroyed the Grand Storehouse, taking with it a large quantity of the historic armory collection. And in the Second World War, the tower was bombed on multiple occasions, killing people within the walls and destroying several buildings. Which brings us to today. The Tower of London is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, inscribed in 1988. It receives visitors in the millions in a normal year, making it among the most visited paid attractions in the United Kingdom. It is cared for by historic royal palaces, and it remains a working institution with the yeoman warders and their families in residence. A practical note, since a great many people watching will go early. The tower is among the busiest attractions in Britain, and the jewel house queue in particular builds through the morning. If the jewels are your priority, go there first and see the rest afterwards. The yeoman warder tours are free, included in the ticket, and are genuinely the best thing on offer. They run frequently, they last around an hour, and the warders are professional storytellers who have lived on the site for years. Take one even if you dislike guided tours. Do not skip the White Tower for the execution sites. It is the oldest and most important building there. The Chapel of St. John, inside, it is remarkable, and the Royal Armoury's display is substantial. The Beauchamp Tower graffiti is easy to miss and is one of the most affecting things in the whole complex. The ceremony of the keys takes place nightly and can be attended, free by applying in advance. Places are limited and are usually taken well ahead, so it requires planning. But it is the closest thing to seeing the building do the job it has always done. And a note on what is not there. The moat is dry, and has been since the 1840s, when it was drained on public health grounds after it became stagnant. It is now grass, and in recent years has been used for large-scale installations, including the ceramic poppies, marking the centenary of the First World War. So let me draw it together, because the argument here is different from the castles trilogy. In Ireland, Wales, and Scotland, we asked what castles tell you about the state that built them. The tower answers a different question, which is what happens when a single building never stops being useful. Almost every fortification we have examined in this series eventually became obsolete. Artillery ended the medieval castle. The closing of the Scottish border ended the Peel Tower. Fort George was finished for a war that had already ended. The tower never became obsolete because it never had only one job. When it stopped being a useful royal residence, it was still the Mint. When the Mint left, it was still the Arsenal. When the Arsenal was superseded, it was still the Jewel House. When it stopped being a prison of state, it became, almost immediately, a monument to having been one. It has been continuously occupied and continuously employed for 950 years by a state that has changed its religion, its dynasty, its constitution, and its empire in that time, and the building simply absorbed each change and carried on. That is the actual achievement, and it is more impressive than the executions. And it is worth remembering what it was for at the beginning. Not defense, control. A foreign king with a hostile capital built a white stone tower larger than anything the population had seen at the corner of their city wall, facing inward. 950 years later, the population queues up and pays to go inside. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more stories of the great cities, empires, and institutions that built the world we live in. Leave a comment below telling us which castle, city, or institution you would like us to explore next.